All right, we're ready to get started. Turn in your Bibles to the book of 1 Corinthians. We're going to start a new book today, 1 Corinthians. 16 chapters, can't take us more than 2 years. So 1 Corinthians is where we're going to be. Now, as far as our prayer list, was anybody left off we need to put on there that we know of? Okay, sounds like we did pretty well. Let me get my Bible. We'll be ready to start. All right, as we study the book of 1 Corinthians, what are some parts of Corinthians that stand out to you? When you think of 1 Corinthians, what do you think of? Can you think of anything? There's a church with a bunch of problems, yeah? Okay. A lot of questions in the faith, okay? A lot of beautiful passages, right? 1 Corinthians 13, what's that on? Love, right? Love. And it's the best definition of love. You start there in verse 4 and go through verse 8, and it's just beautiful right there, okay? Huh? Our citizenship is in heaven? Oh, you're talking about our citizenship as far as in the world. In the world, but not of the world. Yeah. Okay. 1 Corinthians 15, the longest passage talking about the resurrection. Okay. John plays with it, touches on it. 1 John 3, 2, other places like that. John 14, 1 through 6. Paul really delves into it pretty good, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians. But perhaps the best description of the resurrected body is found in 1 Corinthians 15. It's really pretty there. Good stuff. Okay. The power of the gospel is found quite a bit in the first 4 chapters. Okay. Foolishness of God is greater than the wisdom of man. Right? Any other things we come across? All right. What I'm wanting to do, and as far as the style of our study, is almost make it a topical study going through the book. So there's some times where we will just kind of be compact and we'll spend a week or two on a verse or two. And there's some times where we will just kind of fly over. But what I'm after is I'm trying to hit a lot of the topics that are hot today in the church. You may have noticed, may not notice, and if you don't notice, that's perfectly fine. If you go, one thing I've tried to do, and it's kind of a goal of mine, I'm going to be done with it in 3 years, is have a little lesson plan on each book of the Bible, especially the New Testament. And they're all free. It's at markdray.wordpress.com under the I think it's under lessons. But you go there's a 13-week lesson of every book of the New Testament. And I'm not quite there yet. I've got about 3 to go. But I'm wanting to try to break 1 Corinthians into 13 lessons. Of course, we won't do it. But by doing that, sometimes we have to go a little further, a little bit longer than perhaps we're used to. But you don't care about that as much as you do covering the book of 1 Corinthians. Let's go ahead and I got a little PowerPoint thing today where I want us to study some of this. And hopefully it'll come across kind of an introduction, real quick introduction to the book. You got 1 Corinthians. Comes right before 2 Corinthians, right? That's what I used to do in kids' classes. They say, where's Corinthians? I say, it's right before 2 Corinthians. And they're like, ugh. All right, where's 1 John? Right before 2 John. Okay. Who wrote the book of 1 Corinthians? Paul. Okay. Why is Paul such a neat guy? He wrote almost half the books of the New Testament. Why do we like him so much? And why is he really, really good at writing this book? Where was he born? Tarsus, right? Now, if you put the Mediterranean Sea here, you got Italy over here, and you see that big sea. Remember, Egypt's at the bottom of the sea, the letter C. Israel's here, right? Tarsus is up in modern-day Turkey. I think it's Turkey. It's around that area. Asia Minor. It's right in that area. Now, is in Turkey? Good. Now, what's beautiful about Tarsus, 4th largest city in the empire. You have Rome, you have Alexandria, you have Antioch, Pisidia, and then you have Tarsus. 4th largest city, very, very metropolitan. Now, Perhaps some of you have been to big cities, New York, LA, Paris, London. What's different about a fella from a big city than is a fella in Benton, Kentucky? If you're raised in a big city, do you have a different outlook on life than a fella from the country? What are some of the differences? Okay, varied cultures. So you're used to people from different cultures, you're used to that sort of stuff. Okay, what'd you say? Okay, in the country, you're kind of laid back. All right. What else? You're used to varied cultures in a large city. You're more laid back in a smaller town. What other things would be the difference? It's fast-paced, of course, in a large city. What would be some other deals? Okay, competition is stiffer. Okay. In New York, somebody's looking for a job. You have a couple thousand who are applying for that one spot. Okay. All right, that's not always the case in a smaller town. All right, a lot more competition, a lot more speed. People know less about each other. Okay. You go to a large town, large metropolitan area, people know their wives, they know their children. You start getting into cousins, they have no idea. Right? You get to Marshall County, do people know their cousins? And second, and third, and fourth? You know, hey, this house over here on this hill, that was built by so-and-so, and so-and-so lived there, and this is everything that's ever happened at that house, right? The big town, after a few years, whatever's there is torn down, something new's right back. There's not all that history, there's not all that past, but there's a different outlook. And oftentimes, it's a very worldly outlook. People in the city oftentimes will have a much more worldly, selfish outlook than people will in a small town. A lot of folks today, this week, got their driveways shoveled by neighbors or by people they didn't even know. That's just because we're friendly folk and we like to take care of each other. Does that happen in a big city? Not really. People take care of themselves, don't really watch the other folks. But there's a different mentality that goes with a bigger city. And one of the neat things about Paul, with him being born in a large city, he was designed. If you're going to find a preacher to be the apostle to the Gentiles, Paul is what you would draw up. He is the design for that. Grew up in a big city. Then he went to Jerusalem, grew up at the feet of the great rabbis, so that he was a Pharisee. So he was an expert in the law. He was very, very well educated, probably among the apostles, among the most educated. Of course, Luke would be a doctor. He wasn't necessarily an apostle, but he was obviously educated. And also John was a very educated man. But Paul was highly educated, but he was also a tent maker by trade. Now, why did he make tents if he was such a scholar? What did the Jews have a belief in? They said if you didn't teach your boy to work, you're teaching him to steal. And so even if you taught your boy to be a doctor, or even if you taught your boy through a university, you're still going to have some other job which he can do with his hands and at least make a living, at least make minimum wage. So if we lived in a Jewish society, you might send your boy on to college over to Murray State or Freed-Hardeman to be a doctor, but before you would send him up there, you'd make sure he was certified as maybe an electrician or a car mechanic. Or if your son is going to be a school teacher, you would also find something that he could do on the side, whether it was horticultural, landscaping, something like that. And so most Jews would have a common base trade, and then they would have a different trade, which they would do as far as being a teacher or a rabbi or a scribe or something like that. And so he was a tent maker, which is a big deal when it comes to Corinth, because he lived here a year and a half, and the church obviously couldn't support him. They didn't support him here. And so what did he do? He made tents while he taught, and that's where he met Priscilla and Aquila. Okay, he was converted to the way, and he was an apostle to the Gentiles. Now, this is a picture of Paul. This picture was made about 400 AD, and it is on a wall of one of the churches in Istanbul today. Most pictures of Paul have a receding hairline, and they also have bulging eyes. Now, why do they all have bulging eyes? Remember the end of the book of Galatians? He wrote with big letters. He said, I want you to know I wrote this, so he writes with big letters. And what is the idea about the thorn in the flesh in 2 Corinthians 12? Okay, most people think it was poor eyesight. Perhaps it was when the Lord appeared to him on the way to Jerusalem. The scales fell off. Maybe he always had trouble with his eyesight ever since. That's one of those church traditions which you read in the early centuries. We have no idea if it's true or not. But usually in art, you always see the bulging eyes whenever you see Paul. That's the way you recognize who the guy is. He's not bald, he's receding, and he always has bulging eyes. Okay. Now the most important one, and of course the one that's kind of hard to see, but this is important to see. You see the letters there, or the words there. Corinth was the head of the Aegean League. The Greek cities got together, rebelled against Rome as Rome was just developing its empire. Of course, they lost that battle, the Peloponnesian War, one of the first Peloponnesian Wars. They lost that battle, and so Rome, since Corinth was in charge, completely wiped the city out. Caesar came through, rebuilt it as a Roman city, as a place for soldiers to stay in 46 BC. Population, the lowest I found in all the commentaries, which I ran across, is 400,000. Most of them will say 500 or so, okay? Now, it's got a lot of things working for it. Military town. Okay, if you're a military town, what does that mean? You got a lot of men, all right? And where men are without women, especially in a worldly sense, you've got troubles, okay? Commercial center, and also a busy seaport. You go to just our towns here in modern America, and actually we're higher morally than some other places in the world. What are our seaports? San Francisco, New Orleans, okay? New Orleans, a cleaner town or a dirty town? It's a very dirty town, nasty place to be, okay? Why are seaports tend to be dirty? Sailors have been on a boat a long time, right? They want to come back and they want to have fun. It causes trouble. There was a great temple to Venus there, over 1,000 priestesses or prostitutes. The way in which you would worship Venus and some of these other people was through prostitution. The way you came close to that god in worship is you slept with the prostitutes, both male and female. And according to some of the writers who wrote about Corinth, they would say that many of the prostitutes would stand on the seashore waiting for the sailors to come in, and then they would just follow them right up. So it's a very worldly place. Now, a little bit of geography we're going to play with. Look at the one on the top left there. That's Italy to your left, okay? The boot, that's the bottom of the boot. And that is Greece there, and of course, Turkey is here, Israel is there, Egypt is down there. Now, you'll notice there's the little green, almost canal center right through there. And you can see it a little bit closer on this bottom right one. Now, if you look at where where that yellow arrow is, you see an isthmus, which isthmus is a strip of land. And it goes from Athens to Corinth, right across there. Now, that is what made Corinth. Because if it wasn't for that strip of land, that would be the shortcut to get to Rome, especially in the ancient days. Now, the problem is that strip of land is about 3.5 miles wide. And so you could, this is called the Dialotos, which is Greek for the road. But it makes you sound educated if you say, but anyway, if you say it in Greek. But it's just the road. What they would do is they'd have slaves on either side. You can see the tracks there, or the wheel tracks. And these slaves, what they did full time, is they would take materials off a boat, and they would walk the 3.5 miles with it on their back or on a wagon, and they would drop it off for this next ship on the other side, and then they would pick up the next load coming out of Rome and bring it back. And so many of the slaves, that's what they would do, is they would die. They would do that until they fell over dead. AD 70, 300,000 of the Jewish slaves from Jerusalem were sent, and this is where they worked until they died. Nowadays, you look up Corinth, you'll see a really fascinating looking canal. And it's a canal that goes about 100 feet on either side, and it's real narrow, but they have boats which will go back and forth. Really, just 2 boats at a time can go. And it was developed about 1850 or 1860, I think. But what made this special right here with this isthmus is you can tell it was almost like UPS. You could take almost a week and a half off of travel if you went right across that isthmus and it went in there, because the prevailing winds and everything else under the bottom island, if you went that direction, which is where Paul had to go when he was a prisoner, you ran into the storms and the contrary winds, and so it took a lot longer to get to Rome going around than it did going through. And so Corinth, more or less, had a monopoly because they controlled what came in and what came out of Rome. And so because of that, they grew very commercially, and because of that, there was a ton of corruption here. And that's one of the reasons why, when you're reading there from Acts 16 through about Acts 18 and 19, you go through and you see these towns where Paul's preaching. Thessalonica, we would say. Athens, we would say. Ephesus, which is on the other side where Turkey is at. And in Corinth. Corinth, one of the reasons why it was such a nasty town was because of what was going on here. You had thousands of slaves dying every week. You had all this trade going back and forth, people going along, and a lot of this stuff which is happening. So that's kind of an interesting thing to see there. And that's one of the things that you ought to look at whenever you look at an introduction to the book, because that you'll see that wordplay used a lot of times because everybody was very aware that road that went right outside of Corinth. All right, Paul in Corinth. Of course, in Acts 18, Paul was there having issues. Remember, he got called in front of the court, and the Jews were trying to get him killed, trying to get him imprisoned. And what did the judge do? He told all the other people who were around him to beat Paul's accusers. And so they beat him up, and Paul had an opportunity to stay. And what God told him through the Spirit, he said, stay here and preach. No man shall hurt you, for I have many people who are in this city. So Paul was there for a year and a half. That was during the first journey. Second journey is when the book was written from Ephesus. Paul heard about the deteriorating condition of the church, heard about some of the issues from the household of Chloe and the things going on. The last slide I have, that's a quick outline, which is too small to read, which is perfectly good because we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. But notice the main divisions. Chapter 1 through 4, the cause, the curse, and the cure for division. Why divisions happen. And we're going to focus on chapter 1 this week. Next week we got involvement fair. Lord willing, the week after that we're going to focus on chapter 3. And that's where we see the cure for division in the church. Moral problems. Wow, they got some issues, don't they? Chapters 5 through 10. What goes on when good people in the church do things they're not supposed to do? Adultery, suing each other, trying to figure out who should be first. Okay? Now those things don't happen in the church today, do they? Well, maybe more than they should, right? And so we're going to look at the cure for all those moral problems. Now, third section, 11 through 14, church problems. Lord's Supper, okay? Always been a problem in the church, the Lord's Supper, how to make that work the way it should, okay? Role of women in church. Giving, although giving is a little bit more in 2 Corinthians, but you see a lot of those things. The resurrection, what do you believe about the end times? Should you still be faithful? Is heaven real? Is hell real? What happens to people when they die? Okay, all that's in chapter 15, and of course, closing remarks are in chapter 16. But that's some of the basic stuff which you see here as we run across and look at some of these things. All right, now go ahead and turn in your Bibles, 1 Corinthians 1. Let's look at verses 10 through 17. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 10 through 17. And I'm reading from New King James. Now I plead with you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing, that there be no divisions among you, but you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. For it has been declared to me concerning you, my brethren, by those of Chloe's household, that there are quarrels or contentions among you. Now this I say this, each of you says, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, or I'm of Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, lest anyone should say that I baptized in my own name. Yes, I also baptized the household of Stephanas. Besides, I do not know whether I baptized any other. But Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of no effect. All right, as we read through there, what is it that Paul's worked up about? Especially in verse 10. What is the problem? The very first problem he has to deal with when he gets to Corinth. They're divided, okay? Worst thing that can happen to a church, and oftentimes the most common thing that happens to a church. When churches split, it's not always due to doctrine. A lot of times it's personality, and we decorate personality with doctrine, okay? Churches like to split. And the reason for that is because the world splits. Okay, the world looks at us. The world looks at me, and he sees a middle-aged white male living in the South who probably, because of my race and background, I'm probably going to vote Republican. Society, that's what they see, okay? Now, you go move me 500 miles to the north, move me 1,000 miles to the west, they're going to think totally different things about me because we have an idea about Northerners, Southerners, Easterners, Westerners. We have an idea about white, black, Mexican. We have an idea about male and about female. Now, that exists even in the church. We tend to divide ourselves in so many different ways. Now, Christ came to make us one, right? Galatians chapter 3, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, but we are all what? One in Jesus Christ. By what? Yeah. People looking at themselves, putting themselves in one way or the other, whatever else it might be. What happened in the church of Corinth is it was splintering up. And you had people who were mad at each other, people who were fighting with each other. And we'll see over the next few weeks, you have some people who are living immoral, and some people who say, hey, I'm on their side because I'm related to them, or I like them. You have some people who are bringing up legal suits against one another. You have some people who are disfellowshipping or whatever else it might be. And it looks like that's happening in the world. It looks like it's happening in the Lord's Supper. It looks like it's happening even in their worship services. It is just a church that is split. A lot of times finances will get there because finances oftentimes wraps around the idea of control. And a lot of times that's one of the reasons why money is such an issue there. And so Paul says, I want you to be of the same mind and of the same judgment. Now, let me tell you what is cool about Churches of Christ, okay? Churches of Christ are fascinating because they're so similar. Now, why that is so crazy is because we don't have a headquarters telling us what to do. There's not somebody in Salt Lake City or Washington, D.C. or Bethany, Virginia or Rome, Italy or London, England telling us this is what you need to believe, this is what you need to preach on, or anything like that. We, as a congregation, are independent. We can do whatever we want. Of course, we have to be faithful to God. But what's fascinating is while Benton is independent, Bryansburg's independent, Union Hill's independent, Walnut Grove's independent, Calvert City's independent, we are so very similar in our doctrine and practices. Because what is our unifying factor? God's Word, the Bible. Jesus Christ is the head of His church, and we follow His teachings, Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20. And so because of that, you find great unity throughout the brotherhood. Now, are there some crazy people? Yeah, there's some crazy folks. But for the most part, you see amazing unity and amazing agreement throughout the church wherever you go. Now, when you start splintering and when you start having trouble, where do you need to go to fix it? You need to go to prayer. And you need to return your focus exactly where it needs to be. All right? There's the old snow story. And man, we're good for snow stories right now, right? 3 boys are out playing in the snow. You know how it is. First day in the snow, you build a snowman and a snow angel. Second day in the snow, you build an igloo. Third day in the snow, you just sit inside and cry. Wish you could go back to school. At least that's what happens in my house. All right? Well, these kids have been out in the snow for a while, and they decide they're going to make a bet over who can walk the straightest path across the field. You heard this one? They want to make a bet over who can walk the straightest path. Well, the first guy says, okay, I know how to do it. I'm going to look at my feet while I walk, and I'm going to make sure that there is no bend and that it's perfectly straight. And so he works his way across the field, staring at his feet, making sure they're straight. What's his line going to look like? It's going to look like a snake, right? Because the topography and everything else gets in our way. Well, the second boy saw that didn't work, and he said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn around, and I'm going to watch where I've been, and I'm going to keep my line just straight as can be. So he walks across that field backwards. What happens to his line? It's going to bend, and it may be straight, but he's not going to end up in the right place, right? All right, the third boy comes up with another idea. Instead of looking where he's at, instead of looking where he's been, he's going to focus on the far end of the field where he wants to be. And he's going to keep that as his focus and step right towards that at every step. Now, when he gets across the field, he's going to turn around, and what's his line going to look like? It's perfectly straight, okay? See how that goes to today's world? A lot of people, their churches are changing doctrines, changing practices and everything because they're looking right here and they say, oh, I don't want to lose my young people. And oh, I don't want to be boring. I got to do something to worship to get everybody excited. And oh, this is the way everybody else is doing it in the popular way. And if I would just do this, I'd get more people. And they're going through like that. And so when you look at them, they do this and they burn out as a church really quick. A lot of people, church-wise, are very, very traditional. They look at what happens in the 1300s and the 1400s and whatever else it may be, and they're so steeped in the past that they allow that to determine where they're headed and where they're going. All right? Not going to be too personal about this, and I'm not going to mention names or anything, but when I was looking to move my Boy Scouts to different places, we had to find a place to go to, preferably a church. We were in a denominational church over in Calvert City a few months ago. And we got to talking about different things which we did and such. And he got to talking to us about practices, moral practices. And he said, it's not our place to judge anybody because in our church we've discovered that we have to think on something for 200 years before we discover what really is truth and what we really believe about it. He literally said that to me. I kept thinking to myself, I'm a scoutmaster, not a preacher. Scoutmaster, not a preacher. Because I was about to preach him a sermon. You know, go to Jesus, go to the Bible, pull out that Bible off your shelf, let's read it, and I'm going to show you. And I was like, oh, I don't need to do this, don't need to do this. I did it afterwards. But, you know, it's really hard, okay? But a lot of churches which focus in the past, for us maybe it's the 50s. For most denominations, we're not a denomination, for most denominations, they put themselves, you know, well, this is the way we've always done it. This is the way we're going to keep it. If we're going to be God's people, instead of looking at ourselves, instead of looking at our past, we got to focus on Christ. Have that mind and judgment of Christ. That's what Paul preaches on. It brings us right back to what N.B. Hardeman would say. He said, when you're in a church that's having trouble giving, preach on Christ. When you have a church that has trouble on attendance, preach on Christ. You have a church which has trouble on morality, preach on Christ. Christ is the answer for every need. It's the need for giving. Look how Christ gave for us. I don't encourage people to give. Attendance. Look how Christ is there for us. So encourage people to attend. Morality. Look at what Christ sacrificed for us. It will help us always to be faithful. That's one of those big N.B. Hardeman quotes. Focus on Christ. And that's exactly what Paul was saying. I don't know if Paul quoted N.B. Hardeman. He was around back there, I think. But I'm just joking about that. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You run back to Acts chapter 9? Yeah, absolutely. Paul changed his mind because he met Jesus. And that's what caused him to be unified with the Lord's church. Yeah, good point that you bring out there. What's happening in this place? Look at verse 12 through, let's play with verse 13. Most scholars, I'm not a scholar, I just read a lot. And that's the reason I wrote that there. They say what's probably going on in the church is they're adhering to personalities, okay? You got a fellow named Apollos from Alexandria. He went to the big university. He is very, very eloquent, right? We find that in the book of Acts. Very eloquent and well-spoken. So those who are wanting to follow somebody eloquent and well-spoken, they're going to say, hey, Apollos is my preacher. That's who I'm going to follow. Other people are saying they're following Cephas, which is the old name for Peter, okay, old-fashioned name, the Jewish name. Those people in the city who are Jewish, maybe left over from some of the rebellions before, maybe who have traveled here as far as the diaspora, the spreading that happened earlier, they're going to say, hey, listen, I really relate to Peter. That's the preacher I like. Maybe some people are saying, hey, Paul, he's an apostle to the Gentiles. He really preaches to Gentiles. And, he is just a rough and tumble in your face kind of guy. That's the preacher I like. And so people are splitting up. And Paul also says some people want to just follow Christ. And he says these people are following in every direction. And when you have multiple leaders, what happens? You go multiple directions. And he says, remember, Paul didn't die on the cross for you. Paul never established a church for you. Don't follow Paul. Same with Apollos, same with Cephas. You follow Jesus and Jesus alone. Now, a lot of times when we look at splits and divisions in the church, one of the problems that's happening is people fall in love with the preacher. Okay? Do preachers deserve respect? Absolutely. James chapter 3, verse 1 tells us that, they're in a pretty hard place in their work. Paul oftentimes says, pray for us as teachers in Ephesians 6 and other passages. Preachers deserve great respect because of the work which they do. God speaks through them as they preach the words of God, right? The gospel is heard. But what happens when we get too enamored with the preacher? Is the preacher perfect?
No, but you want to keep him forever.
Yeah, you want to keep him around forever. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. You want to keep him around, but there's no preacher that's perfect, okay? And you can go through the history of this church. No preacher is perfect. But guess what? Go through the history of any other church. No preacher is perfect. And that's the way God designed it. We're jars of clay. Some of us bigger jars. But we're all jars of clay that God is working through. Okay? So never follow a preacher more than you follow Christ. Follow the preacher, follow Christ, and follow the preacher as far as he preaches Christ. Does that make sense? And that's what Paul is getting at here. Now, what he gets into in these next few verses is used oftentimes by denominationalists because they love, a denominational person oftentimes will love verse 17, okay? Because they'll read that and they'll say, well, hey, that verse says that Christ did not send him to baptize, so obviously baptism is not necessary for salvation. Or obviously baptism is not a part of the gospel. All right? I had a Greek teacher at Freed Hardeman named Dow Flatt. Whenever he'd hear something like that, he'd say there's a Greek word for that. It is baloney. All right? It's not really a Greek word. It's probably Italian. That's not what Paul's saying there. When you use verse 17 in that way, you're taking it out of context. What is it Paul's talking about in that verse? He says, I'm thankful I didn't baptize you. And then he remembers, okay, yeah, Gaius, and the household of Stephanas, yes, I baptized those people. Why is he worried about who he baptized there? Sometimes we get attached, right, to the person who baptized us. We heard the preaching through them. They led us to salvation, and we get attached to those people. A lot of times we get attached to the preacher who came to see us in the hospital, who cared about us. We get attached to the preacher who was up there who married us, and we get attached to the preacher who did the funeral. You know, a funeral for a loved one, there's that emotional attachment which is there. And Paul is saying, I'm glad, in a sense, that I didn't baptize all of you because I don't want your loyalty to me. I want your loyalty to Jesus Christ. And then he's reminded, a lot of people say this is the Holy Spirit saying, hey, excuse me, Paul, by the way, you did baptize that guy. Some people say the Holy Spirit's interrupting him while he's writing this. I don't know if that's the case or not. But he does remember about Stephanas. But he says, your loyalty has to be to Jesus more than to any person. Okay? Now bring that back to a church which is having problems. Sometimes we have issues. You'll have a Moses over here and a Korah over there. They will say, hey, we're in different divisions. You follow me. You do what I do. I'm a leader or whatever else. Paul says when you start seeing that dividing going on, don't follow people, follow Jesus. Jesus comes first and foremost over preachers, over parents, over anybody else. You follow Jesus. Okay? Chapter 1 is an introduction of how to fix every problem in the church. And everything we run through, whether it's suing each other, whether it's dealing with morality, whether it's issues in the Lord's Supper, every time it's going to come back to you follow Jesus and not yourself. You follow Jesus and not what this person says or that person does or whatever else may go along there. All right, any comment? It's fun teaching in the auditorium class. It's good stuff. All right. I was talking to a fella the other day. I was talking to him about teaching in one of the other adult classes. And he said, I like the auditorium because they never talk back to me. He said, those classes, they talk back. Never thought about that before, but sometimes that's how people like it. Okay, verse 18. The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those of us who are being saved, it is the power of God, okay? The word for foolishness there, I've put in the little notes here, is Moriah, okay? It's where we get the word moron or moronic from, okay? Worldly people think that godly people are morons. You come to church, you believe in a God that you can't see, you give money to a church, and you give time and effort to a church. How silly could that be? That's the way the world sees it. But to those who belong to Christ, they recognize it is the power and that it is the great wisdom which is there. Notice verse 22, Jews seek a sign, Greeks seek wisdom, right? Okay. And we see that. You go to Acts 17, you see in Athens, where the Athenians there on Mars Hill and the Areopagus, the great philosophers heard him, Stoics and Epicureans, and they weren't impressed. Some people believed, but for the most part, they just said, hey, he's a seed picker, he's a babbler, he's crazy. Okay, the Jews listened to Jesus. They requested a sign in John 12, multiple other times. Each time, they still didn't obey. But those who are called, according to the wisdom, verse 24, is the power of God. Because verse 25, the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Now, he's going to go through the next few verses, and he's going to say, by the way, look around in church, and next time you get together, recognize it's not the great movers and shakers of society who have come to the church. Oftentimes, it's the base people. Now, is that always true? No, not always true. Crispus, Gaius, many of these other people who are very famous and very prominent came to the Lord. Some of them even lived in Corinth as you go through here. Erastus, who's the city treasurer of Corinth, Sergius Paulus there in Cyprus, some in Caesar's household in Philippians 4:22, Sergius Paulus, who are some of the others? Gaius, as we read over in the John letters. There were very wealthy people who did obey. But for the most part, who was it that obeyed Christ? The poor, okay? James 2, 1 through 9. It's the poor people who come. Now, what's always been a problem in the church is we hang our coat on famous people who believe. And God doesn't use those people. Yes, God uses them, but God oftentimes will choose those things which are weak to work through. Now, why does God do that? If God used the greatest philosopher and the greatest military conqueror for his purpose, who would get the glory? Absolutely. Absolutely. God uses those things that are weak because it gives him the glory in all things through everything. Okay? All right. Next week, we've got the involvement fair. Be sure to be a part of that. And then the next week after that, we're going to study a few verses out of 1 Corinthians 2 through 4, and we're going to look at how to solve church problems, how to solve church disputes. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your participation.